There, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Carl Schmitt. We're looking at reading Carl Schmitt's concept of the political. Today, we're doing section 5. There's 8 sections in the Schmitt's concept of political. If you hear the fan, please forgive it. The fan is on because we don't have any air circulation in the room because it's getting warm outside and the air is here, and so there's fumes next door. So I hope that this fan noise isn't that loud on the system. Um, well, let's go right to the point. This is what we dealt with the question. Now let's deal with 5. To the state as an essentially political entity belongs jus belli, just war. The legitimate use of warfare concept, right? I.e., the real possibility of deciding in a concrete situation upon the enemy and the ability to fight him with the power emanating from the enemy. The entity. In other words, the entity in question, the body politic, this thing that is here, that the thing, the political entity, in what it is, the state. The state is the political entity in this moment, and that therefore it has power in it. It has power through its members, its parts, and the resources it has access to, and it can mobilize and generate. This is, in other words, if you're going to fight the enemy, you have to use fight him with the power emanating from the entity. As long as the politically united people is prepared to fight for its existence, independence, and freedom on the basis of a decision emanating from that political enemy. This specifically political question has primacy over the technical means by which the battle will be waged, the nature of the army's organization, and what prospects are for winning the war. So, therefore, questions like, in other words, okay, what is the political questions like? Okay, how the technical means of by which the battle will be waged, the nature of the army organization, and even the prospects of winning the war are technical aspects in that sense. They're not the political in this. They're different issues. They're not insignificant. They may be informative, but they're not primarily what the political concerns with, right? Rather, it's the decision whether who is the end. There was question of, um, in other words, there's some preconditions. That this specific political question about, well, who is the enemy and should we is it necessary for us to fight him? This is the political question. Now the question also then becomes the conditions that need for a political entity to be consistent. It has to be, and he says, he's right here. He says, as long as as politically united people is prepared to fight for its existence, independence, and freedom on the basis of a decision emanating from the political entity. In other words, they have to. In other words, the entity makes a decision, but if the people aren't willing to fight or do it, in other words, they don't want to fight. They're not willing to fight for its existence or independence or freedom. What will happen if they block it? If they make it impossible to do that, then the political entity ceases to be. In that sense, that's what he said earlier. And this is what's interesting about this, right? So therefore, we have to distinguish between what is the political point he's trying to point here is this decision to decide who is the enemy, who is the threat to the system, in that sense, uh, um, and what to do about it in that sense. What to do about it in terms of, should we engage war? Should we, what should we do? What decision should be, right? The development of military techniques appear to move in the direction which perhaps permit only a few states to survive, i.e., those with industrial potential would allow them to wage a promising war. So therefore, this technique and these things, in other words, these things suggest techniques, and the military techniques suggest that only states with resources and things like this would have the probability way more. Should smaller and weaker states be unable to maintain their independence by virtue of an appropriate alliance, they may then be forced voluntarily or by necessity to abdicate their jus belli. In other words, their just ability to, their ability to engage in just conflict, to wage war on to wage conflict on their enemies. Here, if you can't make war, if it's impossible for you to make war, um, then you should not be engaging in it, he's suggesting in that sense, right? The numerous changes and revolutions in human history and the developments have produced new forms and dimensions of political groupings. So therefore, he's saying that, okay, therefore, in other words, if you can, you should this way, that you can create alliances, but there may be new, in other words, that over time, what is the political grouping has adopted, has evolved, he's saying. In other words, the numerous changes and revolutions in human history and development has produced new forms and dimensions of political grouping. Previously, existing political structures were destroyed, and new kind of foreign and civil wars arose, and a number of organized political entities soon increased or diminished. In other words, this is, you can say that the cities, the structures, the states. If you look at the idea of the rise of the nation, before nation, there were subordinate entities. Look at Germany. Germany had multiple states that became one state. Again, this is what he means. That there is this a change in evolution, and maybe even the idea is that the multiple states of Europe could become a European state. Okay, that this is possible. This is evolution. This is not. He's not arguing for the permanence of nations or permanence of political systems. The political is simply just, in other words, the entities may change, evolve, change, and their number may increase and decrease. But what is the political is still the question of there's an enemy. There is the enemy. There is someone who forces us, an other who threatens, existentially threatens our existence. That they are threatening our existence, our interest, our care. Now, let's look at this next thing. The state is the decisive political entity, possessed of enormous power, the possibility of waging war and thereby publicly disposing of the lives of men. Okay, so therefore, this is Weber's idea of. Remember back Weber's in his essay definition of, in his essay the politics vocation, where he defines it is that the state is the sole holder of legitimate use of violence. Okay, and that therefore this is what he's kind of agreeing with Schmitt, is agreeing with Weber here. The jus belli, or I think just belli means literally belli means war, conflict, or war. Bella, and us means just war, contains such a disposition. It implies a double possibility: the right to demand from its own members the readiness to die and hesitancy to kill the enemy. So double member, they're able to demand that your soldiers, in order to do this, and your soldiers must willing to die, and that you must kill the enemy. This is what he's saying, and that's it. This double thing. The endeavor of the normal state consists above all in assuring total peace within the territory of the state, and territory. So therefore, another thing it does, the endeavor of the normal state is peace inside its territory. Okay, in other words, to create tranquility, security, and order, and thereby establish the normal situation is the prerequisite for legal norms to be valid. In other words, you must have peace. You must have, i.e., says tranquility, security, and order. These are the prerequisites. by which legal norms need to be in order to be valid. Every norm presupposes the normal situation, and no norm can be valid in an entirely abnormal situation. This is what this is. This is that weird. This is the point. Is that the norm is the laws, the normal, the norm. This is a typical, but it's this typical situation. The normal situation is what of tranquility, security, and order. But when it's no longer tranquil, no longer secure, or when there's disorder, laws don't have impact. He's saying the laws, the norms, just there are no norms, or norms are not binding, as laws won't be binding. As long as the state is a political entity, this requirement for internal peace compels it in critical situations to decide upon the domestic enemies. That's important. So those that who is a domestic enemy? The foreign enemy is the foreign state, the foreign actor who is seeking to harm the the community, that entity. But a domestic enemy is an enemy within the system who's trying to destroy the system as well. Okay? Every state Every state provides, therefore, some kind of formula of the declaration of an internal enemy. The polemenos declaration, the polemenos, the enemy declaration of the public law of the Greek republics and the hostis declaration and the Roman public laws are but two examples. These ancient Greeks, who was the enemy, whereas the form is sharper or milder, explicit or implicit. Whether ostracism, expulsion, or prescription or outlawry are provided for in specific laws, or in explicit or general descriptions. The aim is always the same, namely to declare the enemy. Now, the Greeks had this tendency of looking at people who they thought were a threat to the regime, that they would think as threats to the city, or not only to the regime but to the polis, the political community, and that they would the Athenians ostracize, right? Other cities, cities could ostracize. They could kill too if they took them as threats. That's the idea. That he's saying that the Romans did declare this also. The Roman Senate, they declared you the hostis. It was necessary to kill you, in that sense, right? That therefore these two examples of the Polemenos declaration or the hostis declaration in Roman public law, these are what? They're either, whether the form is either sharper or milder, explicit or implicit, technique, ostracism, expulsion, prescription. Prescription usually means killing them, right? Or outlawry, that they made outlaws and they were excluded from it, are provided for in special laws or explicit general descriptions, right? The aim is always the same, to declare the enemy. That, depending on the attitude of those who had been declared enemies of the state, is possibly a sign of civil war, i.e., dissolution of the state as an organized political entity, and internally peaceful, territorial, enclosed, and impregnable to aliens. In other words, that, oh my God, what happens is the dissolution of the state. In other words, the civil war, the system breaks down, and what happens is that the parts are at war with each other, and by the parts being at war with each other, then the state as a unity, as a whole, is dissolved. Because why? Because it's the state as an organized political entity, internally peaceful and territorial enclosed and impenetrable to enemy, that it's no longer, right. The civil war then decides the future fate of this entity. In other words, that how the war results, whether that state survives, it perpetuates, or it changes, or dies. More so than for other states. More so for other states. This is particularly valid for a constitutional state, despite all the constitutional ties to which the state is bound. So he's saying that this is even more true to a constitutional state. This is particularly valid, despite all the kinds of the constitutions by which everything is bound by it. In a constitutional state, as Lauren von Stein says, the Constitution is the expression of the social order, the existence of the society itself. As soon as it is attacked, the battle must be waged outside the Constitution and the law, hence decided by the powers of weapons. Now, omitted here is a long note on Schmitt, an example of enemy declarations, right, from Lawrence von Stein in his essay. Um, so there was a note here, but this was moved. The authority to decide is in the form of, in other words, the authority to decide in the form of a verdict on life and death. The jus vexia ac necia can also belong to another non-political order within the political entity, for existing in the family, or to be the head of the household, but not the right of the hostis declaration, as long as the political entity is in actuality and possesses the jus belli. Now this is important to notify the difference. The power of life and death was the power of the Roman father, he's saying, right? That this claim of us of life and nesia, that power of life and death, the law of the justice, the rule about this, the right of this. That this is found in other things other than political thing, but the power to declare who is the enemy, that is only the political. Okay, if the political entity exists at all, the right of vendettas between families and kinfolks would have to be suspended, or at least temporary during. Would have to be suspended, at least temporarily during a war. In other words, uh, would have to be suspended, at least temporary. This would be suspended. In other words, the idea is that vendettas and these things, when the normal time should happen, either should be suspended or not, but at least suspended during a time of war, conflict outside, right? In other words, the right of vendettas between families, kinfolks would have to be suspended. Right? A human group which renounces these consequences of a political entity ceases to be a political group because it whereby renounces the possibility of deciding whom it considers to be the enemy and how he should be treated. In other words, if you don't, those who human groups renounce these consequences of what? The possibility of deciding who the enemy is, who is an enemy, and how they should be dealt with. Without dealing with those who renounce that thing, they have ceased to, they have literally ceased being a political group. Um, by virtue of this power, all physical life of men, the political community transcends all other, in other words, the political community transcends all other associations or societies. Within the community, however, subordinate groupings of a secondary political nature could exist with their own or transferred rights, even with a limited power of life and death over members of smaller groups. In other words, even in this thing of a state, there might be subordinate groups with power of life and death. But it depends on the situation of the state. He's not saying that all. In other words, he says that this is a subordinate entity. That the state deals with the ultimate question of who's the collective enemy. But there might be, he says, in other words, by virtue of the power of over physical life of men, the political community transcends all the other associations or societies. However, in such a community, subordinate groupings of a secondary political nature says could exist, where there could be limited transfer of rights that could exist within their own or transferred rights. This idea of the right of life and death, and making concerning this the small group. A religious community, a church, can extort a member to die for his beliefs or become a martyr, but only for the salvation of his soul, not for the religious community in a quest for earthly power. Otherwise, it assumes political dimension. So if you can, it's holy wars and crusades are actions which presuppose an enemy decision, just as other wars do. Under no circumstance can anyone demand that any member of an economically determined society, whose order in the economic domain is based on rational procedures, sacrifice his life in the interest of the irrational operation. To justify a demand on the basis of economic expediency would contradict the individual principles of the liberal economic order and could never be justified by the norms or ideals of a economy anonymously conceived. So there's this lady saying here, what is this? Business, you can't, in business can't, economics and business can't demand you to kill somebody or to die. That you must die for the sake of the business. Or you must see, then that's no longer a business, that's a political endeavor. That is a political endeavor in that sense. Um, the individual may voluntarily die for whatever reason he may wish. That is like like everything in an essentially individualist liberal society, a thoroughly private matter decided freely. So he wants to die for this or that, that. But an organization, the economy can't say go die. I, as a free agent, can say I'm going to die. The company's not. I am going to commit suicide, or I am going to kill him because I want to make. I want the company to decide. I mean, that's the way. Or I'm going to commit. I'm going to die. I'm going to work myself to death. This is the individual making that decision, but the organization saying that you should have to die, you have to die. It can't do that in that sense. Then it ceases being an economic organization in the sense, and it becomes a political organization. The economically functioning society possesses sufficient means to neutralize nonviolence in a peaceful fashion. Those economic competitors who are inferior, unsuccessful, or mere perturbers. In other words, concretely speaking, this implies that this competitor will be left to starve if he does not voluntarily accommodate himself. A purely cultural or civilized system of society will not lack social in, in, uh, indications to rid itself of unwanted uh, perturb, uh, uh, perturbations or unwanted additions. In other words, these things will find ways to remove problems and remove them and do things, but they're not going to say wage war on them and kill them. Right? These people might lose their states of living, and they may not be able to participate and join in, may be excluded. They may, they might starve to death in economic activity. They might lose their job and starve to death, but they're not being killed in a direct fashion, right? But no program, no ideal, no norm, no expediency confers a right to dispose of the physical life of another human being. To demand seriously of a human being that they kill others and be prepared to die themselves, so that trade and industry may flourish for the survivors, or that the purchasing power of grandchildren may grow and is sinister and crazy. It is a manifest fraud to condemn war as homicide and then demand men to then demand of men that they wage war, kill and be killed, so that they will never again be war. War, the readiness of combatants to die, the physical killing of human beings who belong on the side of the enemy. All of this has no normative meaning, but an existential meaning only, particularly in a real combat situation with a real enemy. So therefore, this is not normative meaning that you should do this or this. Rather, this is an he's saying that war and the readiness to combatants to die and the physical killing of human beings on the end. This has no normative meaning. It only has but an existential meaning, particularly in real combat against enemy. There exists no rational purpose, no norm, no matter how true, no program, no matter how exemplary, no social ideal, no matter how beautiful, no legitimacy nor legality which could justify men in killing each other for this reason. If such physical destruction of human life is not motivated by an existential threat to one's own way of life, then it cannot be justified. So I'm saying that this is very, this is almost a kind of, in other words, only this idea of an existential. There's no. He says that what? There's no norm, no rational purpose, no norm, no matter how true, no program, no matter how beautiful, exemplary, no social idea, how beautiful, no legitimacy or legality that justifies men other than this reason. In other words, that there's a real enemy, that there's an existential threat. If such a physical, if such physical if if just physical destruction of human life is not motivated by excess strength to one's own life, then it can't not be justified. Just as little can war be justified by ethical or juristic norms. In other words, he's denying the idea that ethics and law and juristics can justify war. War is justified because there's an enemy and there's a threat to your existence, or you perceive this as a threat to your existence. If there really are enemies in the existential sense as meant here, then it is justified not only politically to repel and fight them physically. That justice does not belong to the concept of war has been generally recognized since Grotius. Okay, and this is note 20. This is the justice, the just war and peace, the laws, the rights of war and peace. Justice is not included in the definition of war. In the scholasticism of the Middle Ages, wars against the heretics were considered just, a bellum justum, accordingly as war, not an execution, peaceful measures or sanctions, right? So Grotius is saying that justice, and actually Hobbes even suggests that there's no in Hobbes is a state of nature, which is the condition of our states are in. There is no justice because everyone has a right to do whatever it wants, and that's justice. Everyone has a right to do whatever they want, and that there's no judge decide whose right is better than the other, and therefore there is no justice. Justice occurs in society, for Hobbes. There is no in war. There is no kind of sorry. The notion which postulates a just war usually serves for a political purpose. To demand a politically united people that it wage war for a just cause is either something self-evident, if it means that the war can be risked only against a real enemy, or it is a hidden political aspiration of some other party to wrest from the state its right of war, the just belli, right of war, right, the right of conflict, ust belli. Yeah, just. This is what ust means in justice, right? It's Latin term for what is just. The just, the law. It could also be a law. Ust gentum was the law of nations, would say, translated. Ust belli is the law of war, or it can be right of war also. It can be translated as Richt in German and right in English. So what is just? Us is justice too. So what is right of engaging in conflict, right? This is that Latin term here in this sense. For as, in other words, in other words, let's do this line again. So aspiration of just belly and to find norms of justice whose content and application in a concrete case is not decided upon the state but another party, and thereby it determines who the enemy is. Okay, that's the danger here. In other words, to demand politically united people that wage war for a just cause only is something self-evident. Is either is something self-evident if it means that a war is supposed to be only against the real enemy, or it's a hidden political aspiration of some other part to wrest from the state its right of war, and to find norms of justice whose content and application is in the concrete case is not decided upon by as the state but another party, and thereby it determines who the enemy is. So for that, in other words, it takes away from the. In other words, either it is the justice situation, or it's a tactic or a thing by a what I use as a hidden some other party, a party, to take from the state its war, to decide who the enemy is, right? For as long as a people exists in the political sphere, this people must, even if only in the most extreme case, and whether this point has been reached has to be decided by it, determine by itself the distinction of friend and enemy. So the people itself, the whole people, the people itself, or remember this idea. See, the problem is we have the people. The question of this is that who decides this ultimately? The state should, but the people should, right? This idea, but then again, most political life is not ruled by individual peoples, but by elites. But that the question is sometimes some elites are the authorized elites, but they're counter elites. What happens if the counter a party in the system shapes the opinion for its agenda using these norms of justice and things like that, ethics, to kind of convince the people that this war should be waged. Right? This is that it steals from the state. In other words, it takes from the state this collective thing. So this idea here is, so as long as a people exists in a political sphere, this people must, even if only in the most extreme case, and whether this point has been reached, has been decided by it, determine by itself the distinction of friend and enemy, whereby resides the essence of of political existence. In other words, determining who is the friend and who's the enemy. This is the political question. Whether it is no longer when it no longer possesses the the capacity or the will to make this distinction, it ceases to exist politically. If it permits this decision to be made by another, then it is no longer a politically free people and is absorbed into another political system. So, in other words, if they're not doing it, if the people are not refusing to make the decision, and that others do it, then what happens is the thing that's deciding who's the friend and the enemy, they are the real political system, and the people absorbed into it. I'm going, right, isn't this how we can argue? Some people argue this is how the European Union is. It's that the nations have lost their control of who's it was the real power of deciding this is now controlled by this larger entity, and therefore that's the real political system. The justification of war does not reside in its being fought for ideals or norms of justice, but in its being fought against the real enemy. All confusion of this category of friend and enemy can be explained as a result of blendings of some sort of abstractions or norms. In other words, we start adding norms and external things to it, and it leads to confusion of this. A people's right, a people which exists in the sphere of the political, cannot, in case of need, renounce the right to determine by itself the friend-enemy distinction. It can solemnly declare that it condemns war as a means of solving international disputes, and can renounce it as a means of national policy, as was done by the so-called Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. Okay, this is that note here contains the text of this August 27th contains the most important reservations. English national honor, self-defense, the League's covenant, and Locarno, welfare and territorial integrity of territories such as Egypt, Palestine, and so forth. For France, self-defense, League's covenant, Lorego, and neutrality, and neutral treaties above all the observation of the um, 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 uh, um, above all the observations of the Kelloggrat. For Poland, self-defense observation of the Kelloggrat, the League's covenant. The general juristic problem of reservations has so far received no systematic treatment, but even there were explicit treatments mentioned to sanctify the sanctity of treaties, and the sentence "pacta secunda severa." Uh, um, uh, this to fulfill this gap, notary beginning to be found in Carl Bringer's right. This thing. With respect to the general problem of pacified humanity, see section 6 below. On the fact of the colored brand pot does not outlaw law, but sanctions it. See Barlard's piece about this idea, right? So that's really interesting thing here about this, right? And so, in doing, it has neither repudiated war as a instrument of international politics, and a war as an instrument of international politics be worse can be worse than a war as an instrument of national policy only, nor condemns nor condemn nor outlawed law altogether. Such a declaration is subject, first of all, to specific reservations, which are specifically or implicitly self-understood, as, for example, the reservation regarding the anonymous existence of the state, its self-defense, the reservations existing regarding existing treaties, the right of a continuing free and independent existence, and so on. Second, these reservations are, according to their own logical structure, no mere exception to the norm, but altogether give the norm its concrete context. They are not peripheral, but essential exceptions. They give the treaty its real context in dubious cases. Third, as long as a sovereign state exists, this state decides it for itself by virtue of its independence, whether or not such reservations, self-defense, enemy aggression, violation treaties, including the Kellogg's Pact, is or is not given in concrete cases. Fourth, war cannot altogether be outlawed, but only specific individuals, people, class states, classes, religions, etc., which by being outlawed are declared to be an enemy. Okay. In other words, war cannot be outlawed, but rather individuals, people, states, classes, religions, etc. But and by being outlawed, they became an enemy. The solemn declaration of outlawing war does not abolish the friend enemy distinction, but on the contrary, opens new possibilities by giving an international hostis declaration, new context and new vigor. In other words, he's saying that and this is very interesting that international norms like this now create, like the Kellogg Brand Pact, which now creates conditions, but of those who violate it, right? Not only nations reserve the power to do it, but nations also deserve the power to declare, well, this person is guilty of this, and therefore creates what? A new hostis declaration, an international one. So traditionally there was a national one, or at the political, but then there was, in other words, there's two now. There's one within the nation itself, the nation, the political entity itself, and now there is this international norm that can declare it. Where this distinction to vanish from, then political life would vanish altogether. There's this idea with this distinction of who can declare the enemy, that there is an enemy, and where this distinction to vanish, then political life would vanish. A people which exists in a political sphere cannot, despite entreating declarations to the contrary, escape from making this faithful distinction. If a part of the population declares that it no longer recognizes enemies, then, depending on circumstances, it joins their side and aids them. Okay, in other words, in certain circumstances, they're on their side. Such a declaration does not abolish the reality of the friend-enemy distinction. Quite, uh, uh, quite another question concerning citizens of a state who declare that they personally have no enemies. In other words, quite another question concerns citizens of a state who declares that they personally have no enemies. A private person has no political enemies. Such a declaration can, at most, say that he would like to place himself outside the political community to which he belongs and continues to live as a private individual only. Now, in this case, it is a matter for the political community somehow to regulate this kind of non-public, politically disinterested existence by privileges for aliens, internment, extraterritoriality, permits of residence, concessions, laws for metrics, or on the Sohan. On aspiring to a life without political risk, definition of the bourgeoisie, see Hegel's assertion below section 7. Right? So this is, oh, hold on. Oh no. Furthermore, it would be a mistake to believe that a nation could eliminate the distinction of friend and enemy by declaring its friendship for the entire world or by voluntarily disarming itself. No, he's saying if even that they did, it's stupid because there's going to be people who are have reasons to look at you and as not being us, an enemy. So that's because you don't see the other person as enemy. They may see you as an enemy, and that they may be your enemy, but you don't. You're intentionally being blind to it, right? The world will not thereby become depoliticized. It will not be transplanted into a condition of pure morality, pure justice, and pure economics. In other words, this is not going to happen. The depolitization of the world is you talk about, but it's a politicization. There's always going to be enemies, and what will happen is even if you conquer the world like this, then what happens is there will be the divisions will go within the system, and that the enemies will be internal. Okay, the system. There's always going to be the conflict of the existential enemy. And actually, this is the difference of Mr. Schmitt and Mr. Huntington. Huntington thinks that nations, these national cultural things, I argue, Schmitt, I think, agrees with me that these come and go, these evolve. But the concept of the political, of this friend-enemy concept, that people who are your enemy and are going to be your thing, this is always going to be the engine of the political. And therefore, the political can never be transposed or replaced by systems of morality, systems of justice, or even economics. Economics, there's going to be, and what is the political? Remember what the political means. The enemy is someone who wants to kill you, and that will risk his life. That this idea that I am an enemy means that there's an life and death is at stake. Not just mere life. And remember, he says that the power of life and death is some important thing, but the life and death not only of the people, but the individual, but life and death of a community, a political entity. If a people is afraid, um, uh, 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 if a people is afraid of the trials and risk implied by existing in the sphere of politics, then another people will appear which will assume these trials by protecting it against foreign enemies and whereby taking over political rule. The protector then decides who is the enemy by virtue of this external relations of protector and obedient. In other words, someone else will take it over, a protector here, right? This idea of the protector. The people themselves are too unafraid to do it, then someone will take it, and the assumption is, I'll do it for you, but you have to do something for me. In other words, And by the way, that's how ancient kings emerged, right? This is how primitive man, this is how the early societies formed themselves. Warriors took over, people who protect people. The people themselves didn't have the ability to fight. They let people who did have fight, and therefore they said, "Okay, you're going to fight for me. Okay, great. We will follow you. You know, you're providing peace and security for us." And blah, 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 okay, this is a Schmitt note here. This is on this principle rests the feudal order and the relations of lord and vassal, leader and led, patron and client. This relation is clearly and explicitly seen here. No other order, no reasonable legitimacy or legality can exist without protection and obedience. The protector ergo obligio is the cogito ergo sum of the state. In other words, the protector and the ones who are ergo obligation, right? So protection and obedience. Okay, yeah, that's, I just checked it. I need to check it. Yeah, protect. I mean, I must protect. I must protect this relationship, this idea, the progato ergo obligato. I therefore I must protect is the cognitive. I think the for am of the state. This is the responsibility to protect, right? The responsibility to protect. This is the foundation of the state. Um, the political theory which does not systemically become aware of this sentence remains an immediate fragment. In other words, a political theory does not systematically become aware of the sentence, remains an inadequate fragment. Hobbes designated this at the end of his English edition of 1651 and page 356 as the true purpose of his Leviathan, to instill in man once again the mutual relation between protection and obedience. Human nature, as well as divine right, demands its inviolable observation. In other words, someone has to protect some other people. Hobbes himself had experienced this truth in the times of civil war, because then all legitimate and normative illusions to which men like to deceive themselves regarding political realities in periods of untroubled security vanishes. If if within the state there are organized parties capable of according their members more protection than the state, then the latter becomes at best an annex of such parties, and the individual citizen knows whom he has to obey. So this is what's dangerous. This is why this is why the state must be the total power holder. If there's private parties who really are the ones offering you real protection, then some people know who to, not the state. They don't fear the state. They fear this. This is the danger of no one should be above the law, right? If there's in a situation where the state is not omnipotent, and any private actor or private party has can ignore the state and its power, and has as much power as the state, or is immune to the state, or does not fear or immune to it, then this is a dangerous situation. This is the breakdown. This is why states break down, right? This is the failure. This is why I don't like. This is my limited problem in Poland, is that there's people who don't are immune. Actually, that's the problem with America too. There's people who are immune to law. Once this happens, then there is no one trusts the state. Therefore, the state breaks down, and there is this crisis. This is de facto civil war. This is what he's saying. It had been shown under section 4 above. A pluralistic theory of the state can justify this. The fundamental correctness for the protection of even the pluralistic state can justify this idea that we have to protect this line of the protector ergo obligation. Therefore, I therefore must protect. The fundamental correctness of the protection obedience axiom comes to the fore before to the front, right? Even more clearly in foreign policy and interstate relations, right? That I must protect this. This is more so in terms of this. The simplest expression of the axiom is found in the protectorate under international law. The federal state, in other words, it's is one under international law, the federal state, the confederation of states dominated by one of them, and the various kinds of treaties offering protections and guarantees. It would be ludicrous to believe that a defenseless people have nothing but friends, and it would be a deranged calculation to suppose that the enemy could perhaps be touched by the absence of resistance. This is what all those idiots who on the alt right, and I'm not I'm a right winger, so I'm sympathetic, but all these what I call, oh, the Ukrainians are stupid to resist. They should simply just not fight. Ah, Schmitt is laughing at you as a moron. Schmitt looks at you guys and say, well, if they're fighting, they're only going to get killed for it. They might as well not do it. Well, that's an idiot. You're an idiot. You're a moron, Schmitt is saying to you, okay? No one thinks, in other words, it would be deranged calculation to suppose that the enemy perhaps would be touched by the absence of resistance. Deranged calculation. It is ludicrous to believe that a defenseless people has nothing but friends. Oh, I'm defenseless. No, that's not true. That's not. Most people won't care. You better get friends. You better have people who are real friends. And it's by not resisting. No one thinks it's possible that the world could, for example, be transferred into a condition of pure morality by the renunciation of every aesthetic or moral productivity. In other words, no one could. In other words, if you or economic productivity. So this is interesting. What is it? No one thinks the world, for example, could be transferred into a condition of pure morality by renunciation of every aesthetic or economic productivity. Even less can a people hope to bring about a pure moral or political condition of humanity by evading every political decision. If a people no longer possesses the energy or the will to maintain itself in the sphere of politics, the latter will not therefore vanish from the world. Only a weak people will disappear. Okay. It's not that in other words, this is a warning to the European elites today, even today. If you don't have the will to fight, and don't hope the world is the system out there is not going to look out for you. There's not going to be a system of the international order to do it. No one will fight for you. And therefore, it's not that the political or the political in the international sense, well, geopolitics will disappear. You'll disappear. That's the warning that he gives here in this sense. Well, that's it. Okay, this dark chapter. Right? We'll stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put them below. If you have any, if you liked it, like it. Come on, like it. Come on, say like it. Share with friends. Spread the word. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. If you didn't like it, say thumb down, but then say in the comments what's wrong and what I do wrong or what I said wrong or something you don't like about it. So that we can learn. People can learn and benefit from their negative input. For those of you who want to follow me on social media, you can follow the links below. Another thing you do if you want to help, those of you out there want to help me doing what I'm doing here, it'd be nice. You can do so through Subscribestar and Patreon. The next thing you can do in that sense. And then the other thing there is you can go if you want to help me by buying my books. My 3 books are available below. Links are below. Okay, that's it. I think that's enough today. We'll see you next time. Next time we see you, we look at chapter 6. Again, I have to remind you these are posted Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now, of course, those of you looking at this after the fact, it's going to be in the library. It's going to be there. But those of you coming to following the schedule as we dropping these live, Mondays and Wednesdays are dropping of the Montesquieu. And to be honest, the Montesquieu recordings are going slow too for me. Not that I should be doing them as well, but I'm kind of slow on them. Um, so we're still out. We're still there. And then Friday at was it noontime Eastern Standard Time, and at um, or 6 p.m. European Central Time. Um, I do my Friday live stream. All right. And that's it. Well, take care and bye bye and have a good day.